We were thinking the exact same thing at the exact same time. Thank you. No worries.
Yes. Great. Okay. So welcome now, those who are watching the video. We're getting started. This is a subcommittee of the short-term rentals working group. And we are here to talk about what kind of information needs the working group has and how we can address those with the full group. So this is not to actually deliberate about any, like what we like or don't like about solutions, but it is really more to figure out what's going to go on the agenda and how we're going to proceed with sharing information and addressing data needs for the group. So I would like to introduce and hand this over to Jeffrey Goodman from Granicus. And Jeffrey, if you want to just introduce yourself, say a little bit about your expertise, and then we can sort of talk about how we weave this into the working group's process.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Jeffrey Goodman. I'm a certified urban planner who's been working with communities all around the country and in Canada on short-term rental regulations and enforcement systems. I wrote really the first article for Planning Magazine, which I'm sure you all read for the articles in terms of how to regulate short-term rentals in a modern internet style one. And I've been working with Granicus as a consultant now for 5 or 6, 7 years on really helping places develop regulations and making sure that they flow from the goals of the community to the regulations and then to enforcement. And so I've been lucky enough to be able to help a lot of places do that, and hopefully I can be of assistance for a lot of technical questions, and then also a lot of questions about the data that we have gathered as Granicus, and how we can use that to move this whole process forward.
Great, thank you. So as I was starting to think about our agenda for next Tuesday, I thought it could be helpful for us to start with a little overview from Jeffrey about the policy development process for STRs, right? Like, what are the questions that he sees that people usually need to answer? You know, what are some of the sets of options that he's seen people work with as sort of levers for achieving different policy objectives, and then an overview on data as we can then talk through specifically what would go into that. So anyway, just wanted to put that out there, my initial thoughts. But John, you had a comment.
Just a quickie, following on from Jeffrey. Jeffrey, if you could send whatever suggested reading articles you've got that you've written or others have written, you know, anything you could help us all, you know, get on the same page with this would be great.
Yeah, that's something that Stacy and I have been working on, are some readings, you know, trying to find things that either give very good backgrounds or, you know, are pretty clear on their slants, because a lot of this research often has been funded by people with a research goal, right? And so just trying to develop a little bit of a library for people to refer to. Some of that's going to come, I think, as we get to more specific questions, certainly about things like housing or economic development. There's good research out there, but we do have a couple things that are more general that we can send around for sure.
Great, thank you.
So in terms of places that have been pretty successful in developing ordinances, really the number one thing that is often skipped, which I know you guys are not skipping, but it's important to note, is what is the goal? What does success look like? You know, in 3 years or 5 years or 1 year, how will you know what you've done has achieved what you want? A lot of places and planners are detail people. They jump right into the details. They want to know how many bedrooms, is it R1 or R2 zones? And if you don't have a goal in mind or have a vision in mind, it becomes very difficult to make choices because there are so many options. I think you've seen just how many different ways you can go with this topic. You need some justification for why you're making the choices that you want to make. And now eventually you have to hash that out with other people. Eventually it has to pass through the democratic process. There's going to be give and take, but otherwise you're just floating if you never have a very clear vision for kind of what you want. The other thing is certainly about language. So there are lots and lots of jargony terms with this issue, and it's very important for everyone to start speaking in a very consistent manner about describing certain things. If I say a whole home rental, that may mean different things, almost certainly means different things to all of you versus say a hosted rental. That means different things, that has different implications for regulation, has different implications on impacts in the community. So that's another thing I think Stacy and I also are working on, is to make sure that we are all on the same page in terms of the terms we use. Beyond that, there are sort of major buckets that a lot of places fall into when they think about their goals or think about some of the things they want to balance. Certainly housing is becoming much more common as a topic. There were lots and lots of places that totally ignored housing, didn't even want to talk about it. Now that's becoming something that is foregrounded more. And so people want to know the relationship between short-term rentals and long-term rentals, short-term rentals and full-time housing, short-term rentals and affordability. And those are complicated questions. We can start getting into the data we would need for that and the assumptions and conclusions we would have to come for that. I wish I could tell you it's 5.8%. It's more complicated than that. And it's always going to be very contextual. Where you are has a very unique set of circumstances that are not applicable to a lot of places that research has been done. So we're going to have to develop some understanding there. Places do look at it in terms of quality of life issues. Often that is hampered by a lack of data about quality of life issues. You might have people who are stewing because of problems, with the short-term rental next door, but they never call it in, right? They never, have it recorded anywhere. They just are upset, right? And that's totally valid. Lots of places look at economic development. What are the effects of short-term rentals on things like the town budget, but also on business development, on workers that are supported? Is it a shift away from traditional lodgers like bed and breakfast and hotels? Is it something new? Is it reaching a new section of the market that is actually expanding opportunities? Is it taking away from things? Those sorts of things. And to me, when I sort of picture the way you start to gather the information to understand where to go with this issue, I told Stacy this, it's a triangle. I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Design, so everything's a shape in my mind. I also have a toddler, so there's a lot of shape talk in my house right now. And it's a triangle. So on one leg would be sort of hard data about short-term rentals. How many listings are there? What are their prices? What's their activity? How many bedrooms are there? Those sorts of things you can really pin down. Certainly data about the long-term rental market and changes in both of those and trying to understand the relationship between them. So that's one leg. The other leg is lived experience. So what is the view from your lawn? What are you experiencing on the ground, positive or negative or neutral, both from neighbors and hosts, from workers, from people who are renters, from everyone? What are they feeling? Because ultimately that's going to, I think, drive a lot of the acceptance of anything. Is what are the results going to seem like from the ground view? And then the third leg is really about governance and the town and the town's long-term goal, the town's town-wide goal, and the ways that things would be enforced. So there are certain things that the government of the town would know and would be expected to do that someone who's just a neighbor or a guest wouldn't really appreciate, and it's not going to come through in the data. So if you take those three pieces, you're able then to really get a good view of the scope and scale of the issue, and everyone's speaking from a common base. Now, I expect everyone to have very, very different views about where you go from that. But people are speaking from a common base that really does ease the process. Because I've been in meetings where it's a 2-hour meeting, everyone's tired, buttons are coming undone, and you realize that we haven't been using the same terms, or we're talking about two different issues. And it just is very, very frustrating, I think, for everyone. So if you start from a good foundation that is shared, we're better able to kind of move forward and hash out the things that really need hashing out, and not some of these things that are solvable by gathering other kinds of information. So that's the process we often see in places that are successful. The places that are not successful, it's loosey-goosey. It's people are throwing in last-minute amendments with the final reading of things. It's a big swamp, and it's a lot easier to build from something that is shared and create something that everyone understands what the rules are and why the rules are in place. They may not agree with why all the rules are in place, but that's a different issue than not understanding why any of the rules are in place in the first place. So that's the process we've seen be pretty successful. And a lot of that does come from starting with data that people understand is pretty solid, and then you can move from there.
Yeah, and just to be transparent, what I put in the chat is, I am trying to sort of synthesize from what came from the last meeting as to what the policy goals might be. So it's that first step that Jeffrey mentioned. What does success look like? I know that a number of members of the group has framed this as like, we need to agree on the problem. And I'm sort of reframing that a little bit to agree on the policy goals, that is the outcomes we're trying to get. So we don't have to argue about the extent to which STRs are explicitly causing a particular problem. Instead, we're saying to the extent that STRs are causing that problem, we would like to resolve it. And then we do need to get some data, of course, to figure out what is that extent and what kind of levers or interventions might make a difference on those things. So anyway, just so you have that in mind. Okay, so Peter.
Jeffrey, can I ask you a question? We could eliminate a lot of our discussion if we knew what the law was regarding grandfathering people that have already started something. For example, somebody borrowed money based on the law today to build a house. We changed the rules down the road. Is that legal? Are we allowed to do that? Or do we have to grandfather everybody who's already started whatever they're doing in terms of a short-term rental?
Yeah, so I will of course preface by saying I'm not a lawyer in Massachusetts, but there has been a recent case in Jersey City where someone claimed that the rules in Jersey City changed while they were operating, and that constituted a taking because they had potential revenue in the future based off of their assumption that the rules would stay the same, and the hosts in that case were not successful. That the judge, at least in New Jersey, said that was not that did not qualify as a taking because there shouldn't have been an assumption that the rules would never change going forward into the future. In Massachusetts, I'm not sure that's been specifically tested, but I haven't really heard that many cases of things that where the law shifted and they sued. That's especially true if you go from a fairly unregulated system to a regulated system. I get asked all the time about grandfathering in places that don't have a current licensing structure, and I say you can't grandfather something in that hasn't been permitted, that doesn't exist in the official records. So I would think that has not come up as an issue, but I think Julia might have an insight on this or a question about it.
Yeah, and Julie, I'll come to you, but just to be clear, I think any legal questions that we have, we can bring our list of legal questions to town council and ask town council to come and give their legal opinion. I think ultimately that's who we're gonna rely on as a group. But Julia.
Thank you. I think that makes sense. I mean, Peter makes a good point that there are some of these questions that are still sort of out there, and we've been talking a lot, and I think that one of the reasons why we're even here today is because there was a case in Massachusetts, not specifically to non-conforming use, but specifically to short-term rentals in residential neighborhoods. That was the Styler case. And so, I've been thinking about, it would certainly help the group outside of this discussion back with a bigger group to have a discussion about, the implications and to answer Peter's question. I agree.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, we're going to need, I think that's another kind of data, right? Is these legal questions. So to hear from this group, other sort of legal questions that you think would be important. And then we can sort of add, we can see, can we get the town council to come to our next meeting, or do we have to wait another meeting or whatever, but hopefully we can get them there to answer those questions. And then we'll have Jeffrey and Kyle and others from Granicus or the town to help answer, the sort of land use and housing and costs and those kind of questions as well. So Julia.
I was wondering, can we start talking a little bit maybe
Yes.
about
Yes.
what kind of data we do have and what might be helpful for the group? So there are a couple of obvious things that I think we have, because we have Granicus at the table. We have, some of the access to their sort of their data scraping, right, abilities. And I was wondering if Kyle could give us just a quick, I think I'm pretty familiar with this, but one of the things that's a little bit different on Nantucket that you may not see to the same extent in a different community is our guess is that the platform STR, so STRs that are listed on an online platform, right, such as Airbnb, Flipkey, Vrbo, constitutes somewhere between roughly 50% of the market. That's like our best guess right now. And with, talking to some realtors about this, the other 50% is, these are STRs that are not cross-listed, let's say on an Airbnb and on a broker site. They are on a local real estate broker's website. And that data doesn't seem to be as easily scraped, frankly. Mainly because, let's say, there's a lot of there can be some significant cross-listing between the different real estate offices, but also it's not as clear what may even be active or not active. Anyway, so I was sort of curious if Kyle or Jeffrey, had already looked into that, and whether that being like what's online right now versus what we have, like, let's say in the registry. There are other tools I know that we have. And what kind of information might come out of that in terms of, average nightly rate, booking, utilization, that kind of information.
Yeah, absolutely. So Granicus is identifying 70 of the major Airbnb type platforms. You're right, the local sites, we're not going to pick them up. If there is one that's super popular, we can look at adding that to the list, but that would be an extra cost. Nantucket is contracted just for us to identify the 70 major ones currently. The data you'll get from our software is who's doing this. So the owner's information, the rental address. Sometimes it's going to be helpful to understand if they're not living there as a principal residence, right? You'll also have access to the number of bedrooms that is being advertised, the amount of people that they were allowing to come to the home. So occupancy, and then anything that's on the assessor data, right? So the actual number of bedrooms in the home, the bedroom count, the neighborhood that they're in, the zone, the building age, the building type. So if you can imagine, like there's over 150 data points that we're pulling in, both from the advertisements as well as the assessor data. So you'll have access to that level of insight. Maybe Jeffrey, because I know you've done housing impact studies before. Is there anything else that I'm missing? That,
Yeah, I actually have
you use for the data?
I have the list because I was writing other proposals. So we collect, and places have found useful the sort of, I'll do a quick list here. The number of listings and the number of unique rental units. So obviously some hosts list properties on multiple platforms. We deduplicate that, but we'll give you both numbers. The physical addresses of places, we can break it down by zoning, by any sort of district you want. We just need the GIS file to do that. The unit type, which is it single family, or is it well, we say single family, it means one structure, or is it multi-unit, including places with carriage houses or mother-in-law suites if it has a separate address. The rental type on the listing, so whether it's partial home, which would be bedrooms, couches, those sorts of things, or for an entire unit. The listed number of bedrooms and bathrooms, if that's included, the occupancy, the nightly rate, including shifts over time. We do some usage and revenue estimates based off of the availability on the calendar, the nightly price, reviews, and a little bit of math. And then also on kind of a bigger picture, the churn. So how many listings kind of come online or leave the industry at various points, because it is both very seasonal, but also people move their listings from active to inactive quite often, even beyond seasonality. So we would have all of that information, and lots of places that I've worked with use that information to start to understand the short-term rental market, especially then they can compare it to the effects on real estate or the effects on long-term housing. So that is all data that we would have access to from those major platforms. From real estate sites, summering sites, we would maybe need to do some additional work to try to figure out what we want to get out of them, and whether we need to scrape them or whether there are important data pieces we can find. And then also correlating those to the listing sites, because I would guess there are probably some that are listed on both, and you don't want to double count them. So that is at least where we're starting from, would be from the platforms. From some of these niche sites, we would maybe need to do a little bit of an investigation as to how best to capture some of the information from them. Like you said, they're not structured in the same way as a lot of the platforms, which make things like how often they're used or what their booking calendar is, or those types of estimates a lot harder, because it's just not presented in the same way that it is on the platforms.
And can I just ask, and then I'll come to John, is like the state registry a way to cross-check and make sure, and at least get a sense of how complete are the platforms for this data? So like Julia said, if the platforms are only 50%, right, that's different than if the platforms are 80%.
Right.
But do we at least have access to that knowledge? Like how much of the actual state of affairs is being captured by the data you might be able to bring?
I think there's some of that. I don't have off the top of my head how reliable we think that data set is, or how it compares to some of our data. Some of that is often it's collected how it's collected, and we have seen some places also use any sort of tax receipts, any sort of tax info they get from the state, to start to break down, okay, well, if 2,000 people paid taxes, but we only have 1,000 signed up and we only have 500 on the platforms, okay, now we understand a couple kinds of issues. So I think there may be some data on that, but I would have to check to see how easy that is to kind of correlate and integrate that information.
Okay. John? John, you're unmuted.
Thanks, Jeffrey. For me, one of the, this was great, the kind of data we can get, but on the island, it's going to be, for it to be really meaningful, it's going to be important that we understand it by neighborhood. A neighborhood is, the reason I say this is because, we don't have the data, but there is a feeling that what's happened over the last few years is that what was the more affordable areas of the island where, the tradespeople, the teachers, the nurses, where they live has been impacted perhaps more than others, in that, there is a lower entry point for whether it's corporate, commercial, seasonal residents getting into their first home in Nantucket. It doesn't at this point matter. What is interesting though is these individual neighborhoods understanding who's been impacted by how much, and is that across the board or is it very different? So are you going to be able to help us with that? Because I suspect, GIS maybe it helps, but it isn't, I don't think, zoning classification.
Sure. Yeah, so we have a couple ways to get at that question. I've worked with places that looked at when were short-term rental listings created, and then compared that to sales information from their assessor, let's say, to see if there's some sort of correlation between when things sold and then when they became a short-term rental. Now that gets at people who come in and pick up property and then turn it into a short-term rental. If it's someone who already owns a piece of property and is long-term renting it and then decides, wait a minute, I could make a lot more money doing short-term renting, that's not going to appear in that because it never got sold, right? But we would be able to look at some of the listing creation dates in order to see if there are patterns, both in terms of geography, but also in terms of time. And you're totally right. The places that often experience the most pressure about flipping are not the most expensive places because you need the most amount of money to try to get in there. It is often the places where housing is relatively affordable. Of course, it's relatively affordable because that's where, if you were going to pick up property, your costs are lower and your income may be still pretty high. So we would be able to use some of the listing data and relate that to either to more than likely to sales data, which would be the hardest data, in order to see, was there some shift in a neighborhood or in a zone, whatever it happens to be, or just an arbitrary boundary, where suddenly you see a lot of sales and then you see a lot of short-term rentals come online.
I think the sales part of it will be important, though, Jeffrey, because again, this is all anecdotal, but
right,
with the boom that's taken place in housing, again, it's that lower end that's sort of shot up. Everything is shot up, but that's probably shot up more than most. But again, we would need to test all of that.
Yeah, one of the nice things though is, one of the reasons why Granicus exists is that, we get you hard addresses. So once you have that address, you can now relate it to the whole constellation of local and state data that exists, including things like construction permits, bills of sale, occupancy permits, zoning change requests, that whole world that exists within government records. Once you have that address and the listing history behind it, you're able then we're able to bring those things together and begin to start to paint a picture about whether there have been some changes. Now, again, if it is someone who owns a property, never sells it, turns it from long-term renting to short-term renting, that's going to be a little harder to pick up because there
Mm.
probably will not be another record that will exist
Mm.
of someone saying, aha, I'm going to do this. So we'll have to intuit some of it, but
Okay.
certainly we can look at some of those patterns to maybe get at that question. Another thing that comes up honestly is sales price, which is, can we relate, and this is using, say, MLS data, are people paying a price premium for something they intend to turn into a short-term rental because they know the income potential is so much higher? We can start to track that by, did things that became short-term rentals, were they priced differently than, or sold for a different amount of money than something that stayed as a long-term housing unit? So we have seen some places look to see, are people who are investing, using that and outbidding people or paying more money in order to get that income.
Jeffrey, I don't want to hog my time thing here.
Sure.
We've got a few more people, but just to finish, and you can get that, we can boil it down to neighborhood.
We can cut it however we want. Once we have we can define whatever boundaries we
Perfect.
want. And once we have the addresses, we can populate it however we want to do that. Yeah.
Perfect.
And I think, get what we're getting at here, like a lot of the questions have to do with changes, right? How have things changed? To what extent have houses that were available for year round, either occupancy or rental, now are not, right? Now they're only available for short-term rental. How has that changed costs, right? So it sounds like you'll be able to using these different pieces, put together a presentation on that actually then shows at sort of it as a whole, but then also at the neighborhood scale. So
yeah, so we have collected data over time. It's not going to be as refined as more recent data where we're really getting into every individual thing very precisely, but it will certainly give some trends, some broader trends about the numbers, about the locations in a more general sense than the exact addresses, price, just shifts in counts and those things. We have some of that data over time. Obviously, the more recent we get to now, the more refined it is. So, if you're asking me exactly how many had 3 bathrooms, 4 years ago, we'll do our best, but certainly the numbers we counted at that time we would have, and their rough locations. Yeah.
Okay, great. Julia.
Thank you. Well, this is a lot of great info, and I had a couple. Oh yeah, I was wondering, Stacy and Megan might remember this from November of last year when the planning department did some work on the registry. You guys did, I think, a lot of work, as far as I understand it, cleaning up the registry and matching it with the GIS. And I was wondering if I could share some of the slides that you guys presented at the select board. I don't know, Stacy, if you're allowed to give me the sharing.
Yeah, we can. I just wanted to know
absolutely
what it was for. Semaine she'll give you permission.
So just to give the group another, like Jeffrey was talking about triangulation, and here, let me see if I can. So this is, some of you may already be familiar with this. It was presented, like I said, in November, sort of before the planning board started talking about what kind of article to bring at town meeting. And so from this screen, I took it that the registry, and I believe the planning director indicated that they had basically cleaned the registry, and I hope Megan can corroborate this, that they had cleaned the registry because, as you all know, assessor data is not clean. The addresses are written in 25, like the same street will be written 3 different ways. And there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done to clean this data. So they managed to match it to the GIS, which is why we can see this beautiful map. And then they also looked at, and once you like you mentioned, Jeffrey, once you tag it to the GIS, all of a sudden you've got the zoning districts. So this was basically just the number of STRs by zoning district. It doesn't go to answer John's question about neighborhoods, but the information is in there. It's just at a different level. And it was sort of like the percentage of total buildings. I already had a bunch of questions about this. Like so from the discussion that was just had in terms of what's available, and I can stop sharing my screen. Because we're missing the realtor data, which is a significant portion, and I don't know that this is private information. This is, I don't know that we'll ever really get it. We could certainly get a count from, like, I'm sure NARAB would volunteer, like, a count or some broad information. But I think the registry becomes like, you sort of have to look at it in a way. And because I think that, my understanding is, for example, the real estate market doesn't have like room sharing so much, right? There's no partial home rented on there. It's all whole house, either a back cottage or not even apartments necessarily. They're really almost exclusively entire properties, and then some entire dwellings. So it will change the nature of what you're looking at when you're trying to assess what even the market looks like. And it's certainly going to change. I think it would change, we may not have information that Granicus is going to have, like, let's say you might be able to scrape the usage, right? So how many nights are these properties rented on the platforms? We're not going to have that from the registry. But what we do have from the registry is a more complete picture. And, Kathy Baird had mentioned that it's not always super accurate. Maybe you have some properties that may have sold. We're going to live this with the assessor data, whether we, like,
if it's the best we got, it's the best we got. Right?
Exactly. So, but one of the things I really love about when we talk about the assessor data is that then when you are talking about year-round housing, not the long-term rentals, that's a really hard place. It's a black box to most people right now, that whole market.
Yeah.
But in terms of home ownership and what may have shifted from, let's say, a year-round residential exemption property, we have that in our assessor data. And so I'm curious if we could go back, and I know, again, you said, Jeffrey, and I think the platforms have only been really popular for under 10 years, let's say.
Yeah.
Right. So the data, the further back you go, the less complete you have of a picture. Yeah. But like you said, if you can get some trends, but certainly I thought residential exemption could be a nice way of either looking at listings, like sales in homes, or looking at the creation of the dates. And people aren't going to really understand where I'm getting at necessarily, but I think there's an opportunity there with the assessor data to look at housing over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, anytime you get into something like a homestead exemption, you then have this other question, not to defame the fine people in local government, but how are there some people taking advantage of loopholes and all sorts of things at the end of the day?
Again, to your point of timing, if somebody came off last year, it might not show on this, but it's the best we have.
It's an entryway into an important conversation. And it is, I think, again, you can get some measurements over time. You can get some trends over time that give you an understanding, or at least a look into what some of the dynamics are. Again, sometimes I've been in meetings where people are like, tell me exactly what it was on August 27th, 2008. And it's like, well, let's look at the forest here. We don't need to necessarily get totally lost in everything. But I think we can look at some trends, and I think those trends can then lead to discussions about how do we understand this problem, especially around housing. I will mention, to your point, long-term rentals, really, really, really difficult to get data on. We can get some data often from real estate agents or other, but if people are using Craigslist or whatever, it's not
a market that's monitored on Nantucket by the realtors, certainly. But so the only place I can see that you can really have, either you put together focus groups of people, like it's going to be a story building kind of an operation. Sure. And then you tag it with, like, we know, and this is, again, like, this is a higher level piece of information or information, but the census data, right, with the housing unit, the household units and that sort of thing, which does paint a picture, because, as far as I remember the numbers, it was like we lost 40% of our rentals, or 37% of our long-term rentals in 7 years. So there's an overall trend, but, then to be able to relate it to STRs is, that's not a direct link.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, Kathy.
Hi, I'm glad that you have all this data that we can start looking at. I'm very excited to be able to start looking at it. Other things I thought of too is, do you have any kind of data or information on the new types of rental models or for short term, for example, like timeshares or fractional ownership or things like that? Is there a growth there? Because I think that's probably something we need to know.
Mhm.
Overall, also, I think economic analysis, if we decide that we want to have X number of tourists per year and not any more than that, does that affect businesses? I think a lot of any kind of policy we come up with, we need to be cognizant of or aware of the consequences of doing that, unintended or intended. So are there any studies along that line on businesses and how many people they need to support it, that kind of thing? And then also the suitability of a lot of the homes for year-round rentals, I think, is another thing, because many homes are cottages, maybe they're not heated, or they can't be lived in year-round, or that kind of thing. So I don't know if that sounds probably like a really soft number. And how much lodging does the town really need to have? How much does it have in hotels and bed and breakfast, and how much are in short-term rentals? And where should that number be? I think that's something that, if we're going to define it as a problem, we need to understand those numbers. Thank you.
So I can very quickly run through those. We're looking at the listing sites. So if things show up that are owned in various structures, we only have so much insight in that. And I know there's been some of these new fractional ownership platforms. There are always timeshares, there's condos, there's all sorts of different things. Unless it's showing up in one of the platforms, we monitor a lot of platforms, we're not really going to capture it. Now, the fractional ownership ones, especially, which are more new, I know Picasa is one. It advertises in the Yale Alumni Magazine, which is why I know it is regulatory wise is a little funky, because if it's owners of a fractional, a fraction of a property, and they enjoy it themselves, that's no different than three brothers owning a home or you owning your home by yourself. It doesn't, oftentimes in regulation, it doesn't actually become a short-term rental because it's not on public offer, which is usually the definition. I know Florida, the state definition actually says, as soon as it becomes available to the general public, now it's a short-term rental. If you just do it totally private, then it's not considered a short-term rental in the same way. And we can investigate the impacts of those or how expansive they are, but they do kind of fall into an interesting zone that often people don't touch. So we can get into that. Economic impact reports, there have been a lot done on short-term rentals. They are often commissioned by, say, the hotel group or Airbnb, which means their conclusions and their methodologies I would question a little bit, because they obviously came into their process with a number in mind that they wanted to go through. So we can look at finding some ones that are maybe a little bit more down the center and not so obviously sort of slanted in one direction, because I've done economic impact statements. You can take it as big or as small as you want in order to kind of reach the number that honestly your boss tells you to reach, right? And then in terms of how much tourism you want, that's a philosophical question. We can talk about other places that have very robust tourism markets and their reactions to tourism. There's been a lot of interesting research, especially out of Europe, about how much tourism is too much tourism, which is now a question that places like Barcelona or Venice are asking. But that's a policy question or a philosophical question that's not going to necessarily come through data specifically. Yeah.
Thanks. Peter?
Just a couple things. One is, I have this document called Measuring Nantucket's Daily Population that was put out by the Community Data Platform, which really goes through, this is 2014 to 2021, showing the population on Nantucket. I don't know if this is available to everybody. If it's not, I have a copy, we can get it to everybody. Do you have a copy of it, Jeff?
I do not. I'd love to see what they're doing there.
Okay, so I'll get a copy to Stacy and then they can get it out that way. I'll have to get it copied. Okay, second thing is, one of the major things that we're not discussing, and I don't know how we find this answer, if we make any regulations at all different than what we have today, there's going to be a major real estate impact in terms of value. And I think that we need somebody to give us an idea. Is Nantucket's real estate values going to drop from, $1 trillion to $1 billion? I don't know the number.
Right.
But I don't know who gives us that information. Is there experts in real estate that can do that? We have very, very high. Our average home now is up to about $3 million. And if you can't rent houses anymore long term, it's going to have an effect on the value of the homes, obviously. If you have two houses for sale, one that you can rent, one you can't, the one you can rent is going to be worth a lot more money.
Yeah.
So we need to know what we're talking about rather than just, making blind decisions about that. Okay, the last thing I wanted to bring up was, do we really need to go down to neighborhoods? Zoning is not enough. I don't know. I just think going to neighborhoods, it becomes personal.
Sure.
When you do zoning, it's not as personal.
I would just say to answer that specific question, often zoning and people's conception of a neighborhood, the maps don't really align, right? Zoning is often a big kind of mess. Whereas if you said, what's that neighborhood? You'd go, well, it's this street to this street to this street to the harbor, right? And so people's understanding, their kind of psychogeography of a neighborhood is maybe different than what the precise zoning is. And so that's why I've seen some places go, we want this to be understandable to people who have never seen a zoning map, who never want to see a zoning map.
Exactly.
So we're going to use the kind of common boundary rather than specific zones, because the zones don't correspond to people. They don't correspond to people's feelings, right? And so that's one reason why you do it. Now, if that's not relevant, or you don't think that that's like the best way to capture some information, then sure. You can also draw totally arbitrary things. I mean, we've seen places say 1,000 feet from this ski lift, just draw a circle around it, because they want to understand that division, and that has nothing to do with neighborhoods and nothing to do with zoning. That's just pure distance. So there are lots of different ways to slice it. It sometimes depends on what you think is just going to be more relatable to people, if that's an important goal. As for the real estate modeling piece, that's something that is a little bit beyond, sort of what we do. It can be very complicated because, I always have to be a little bit of a grump, which is if you own property and you can't do short-term renting, your theoretical value maybe goes down, but you still have a lot of options with that property because you own property. You can live in it, you could rent it out long-term, you could sell it. All these things make you money. And so it becomes very, very difficult to guess at what people would do should the rules change, and thus how do you model it? You're not going to get a very good set of answers if you do a survey of homeowners as to what would you do if you suddenly couldn't do short-term renting. I think a lot of people wouldn't really answer in a way that would be meaningful. So I think that modeling can be really, really difficult to get at something that you say, yes, this feels something that we really can base on. I think a lot of times you end up with sort of like those economic impact reports, kind of whatever you want it to be can be what the number comes out. So that's not to say that we shouldn't investigate what some of the implications are of any changes, but
except it has major implications on taxes.
Sure,
and
yeah.
if our values go down by 20% and our taxes go down by 20%, we're in trouble. So I mean, I don't know how you balance that. I mean, I don't know the answer.
I think it's very complicated. I haven't seen a lot of places do that kind of modeling, because I think it gets you get a lot of mission creep. It kind of expands beyond it, because you say, all right, we have fewer tourists. Well, they're not spending money here, but we have more long-term residents. So now they're supporting a veterinarian, and like now we have 2 veterinarians. So like it can spiral and be really difficult to understand. And you get assumption on assumption on assumption. And so it can be really difficult to come up with something that then you can give to people and people go, oh yes, this is. I understand.
I totally disagree with you. I think if a house is worth $3 million with a rental and it's going to be without a rental, it might only be worth $2.5 million. I don't know the number. I'm making this up.
Sure.
But we need to, that number has to be somebody who can give us that information. Maybe it's not your group. Maybe it's a more economics-based group or real estate group. but somewhere there's a number. And that is much more important than you're making it out to be. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, that is fine. And I do agree that one of those things that we have to look at are the implications on things like on taxes, both sales and real estate. You know, we can look into, you know, maybe someone who can do that type of analysis that people feel comfortable would be consistent and transparent about how they do it. That really what I'm getting is my concern is that often the people who do those kinds of analyses are not consistent and not transparent. They do kind of whatever the people who hired them want them to do. And then you end up with a document that you probably spent a bunch of money on and waited for it to get. And then, you know, half the people in the audience go, well, that's totally biased, and you toss it out, right? So we can look at who would be someone who would be able to deliver something that people would feel would be transparent, at least, about how they're operating. So yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
That's helpful. And I think to say, like, some of the key questions I think we're getting at here, and to go back to the neighborhood question, right? I think the way John framed the question was, you know, our houses in areas that traditionally have actually been available to workers or year-round residents becoming less available to them and instead converting to STRs, right? And so I think to the extent that we need to look at neighborhoods to really understand that, maybe we can look at that instead of neighborhoods, maybe just by cost of home, right? Or changing, you know, right? Like, so affordability criteria might be as helpful for that as neighborhoods, but it does seem like that is a really important question that this group has, right? Are we losing available housing because of STRs? That's something people really want to know, right? And I think the converse of that, which maybe some of this economic data might be important for, is to know if people couldn't use this home as an STR, would it become available as a year-round home? Would it become affordable or accessible as a year-round rental, right? Like, what would what can we know about the potential implications of removing that option from homes? Or would it just be bought by somebody who was rich enough to never have to rent it, but would still only come once a month, or like, not that seems to meet people's goals less. So that's why that kind of information seems important. So whatever you can do with reliable data, and at least with caveated data, if it's not fully reliable, but maybe somewhat reliable, right? That would be really important. But I do think, Jeff, to the extent it's like none of this is reliable, then like, let's not even look at it, right? It's either biased or it's not really reflective of reality. So
I do want to address something that I saw in the chat from Kathy, which is, you know, we use the term visitors or tourists, and there are lots of different types of people within that, in terms of the length of their stay, the implications of their stay. And, you know, I think it's be very difficult to get a good sense of, maybe, you know, like a tourism bureau would have some idea about, are people there for the weekend? Are people there for a month? Are people there for the whole summer? Are people there off season? You know, this gets back, I think, to what we led off with, which is what was our goal. And, you know, do we need to know necessarily the exact breakdown of tourists if our goal is to examine long-term housing that becomes short-term housing? I don't really care that much if that's my goal, whether that person is there for a day or for a month, if the goal is that it's available for a year to a long-term renter. So some of the ways that we look at our goals can shift kind of our data priorities. But I do think one of the difficult things about this issue is there are so many different types of users and so many different types of uses, right, that we kind of lump together as short-term rentals, when the implications or the impacts on the community are really all over the place. And so often, sometimes it's useful to start with the impacts. What are the impacts that we want to promote or guard against? And that leads us back to what are the types of users and uses that we want to limit or shift or expand or whatever. Just because otherwise you get so many different types of arrangements and timings and ownerships and all these things that make it really difficult to capture the sort of broader goals that you want. And I've seen so many public meetings devolve into, someone comes up and says, well, me and my two brothers, we own this house and each of us is here a month, but I'm here actually 6 months. And it's just like, it gets so complicated that you kind of lose track of what you're really thrusting to do. So always keep that in mind, that even though we're using these pretty big umbrella terms, there are lots and lots and lots of nuances to it. And we have to kind of decide how we filter those in order to get at particular interests.
Yeah, so it is noon. We had scheduled this meeting to go until noon. I actually can stick around a little bit longer if we want to just try and make sure we can tie up what we want Jeffrey to be able to present. And I think just going through, having people say, here's some other questions or some other data, can you include those? And then my question to Jeffrey and Kyle will be, can you put together a presentation for our meeting next Tuesday based on whatever it is you've heard here, doing your best to answer questions, and then, name like, okay, and then here's some follow-up stuff we would still need to do to get it more of this, that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Julia.
Okay. In thinking, we don't have much time here. It seems like the hard data for the what we readily have is going to be sort of more achievable in the near term, and then on either the registry and the scraping of the platforms, like the Granicus data versus the registry, let's call it, with the assessor would be super ideal to have, sort of like a snapshot. And I'm assuming one of the things that could be done rather easily would be to do like the assessor is a snapshot. So you could go back 10 years or 5 years and do, a couple snapshots. Maybe that's follow-up information, not necessarily next week's. To the extent that, I don't know if it's enough to say that, you guys are going to do all this work. If there's, other people that need to be, and I'm not necessarily suggesting myself, I just mean, how do we get to the data we're looking for?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to mention, I know it's sort of to me, it's a different discussion, the idea of what's the vision of what are we trying to create, not just what's the vision for success, but what does the ideal world look like? Like, I came to the table thinking like, we're absolutely going to protect year-round residents who are trying to rent their own home, period. Maybe not everyone agrees with that. I would assume yes, but we want to give seasonal folks the ability to rent their home, some of it, as well, maybe not to the same extent of the year-round, who's on their primary residence, but kind of to Peter's point about, sort of the non-conforming use discussion. I'm trying to not use the word grandfathering because apparently we're not supposed to be using that term anymore. It's not very, it's not politically correct anymore. So I've been advised not to use it. Anyways,
parenting maybe.
Yeah, it's got to do. Anyways, I'd love to give you the history, but it's
yeah,
non-conforming use is the right word. So anyway, so to Peter's point about non-conforming use, there are, instead of necessarily modeling this stuff, which may be difficult, one way to look at it is to look at communities that have been doing it for a long time, who have had a non-conforming use for a long time. I think it's been mentioned in a number of discussions. Kauai is one of those places. And when I had discussions with the folks there, real estate people and town planners, they said the same exact thing. The house that's got the non-conforming use certificate and the house that can't STR, this house is 25% more expensive.
Yep.
And it runs with the land as it would in Massachusetts. You can't expire this when there's a sale or whatever. So, kind of to Peter's point, those are pieces of information that may not be achievable in terms of data points, but they may be enough for us to have a discussion about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
John.
Do you say me, Stacy?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make sure as we wrap up, two things. We talked a lot about, getting the data, whether it's by neighborhood or by income or by value. But the main point of that is, once we have that, can Jeffrey then, or is it someone else, model that out? Well, okay, if we do nothing, then what's the next 5 to 10 years going to look like? And I'm just interested whether that's Jeffrey or someone else, but it seems to me, just knowing where we've come from and where we are today, we're going to need to project that somehow to see what it really looks like. That would be one. And then I just want to make sure, Stacy, we try to nail down, learning from other communities, and Julia mentioned Kauai, and that's exactly right. I'm familiar with that example. But who's going to do this? Because I think it would be a mistake if we just leave it loose that, oh yeah, let's just take a look at a couple of places. No, let's, maybe Jeffrey, there's someone fairly independent in this, say, here are the 5 that you should look at. And 3 of them are going to tell you what happens when it's all good. And 2 of them are going to tell you what happens when it's not. And I really think we need that to sort of help us create a toolbox of, okay, well, on Nantucket, then we could do this, but let's not do that, and so forth. So
Yeah.
I just want to be clear how we're going to go forward with that.
Yeah. And let me just say, my thought was, and Jeffrey and I can talk more about this, right? My thought is, first, we're identifying what your goals are. Then we're identifying what questions need to be answered in order to achieve, better understand how to achieve those goals, and what data exists that can inform how to achieve those goals. Then we want to look at what is the whole set of tools available. Once we know what we're trying to do, what tools can actually help us get there, what kind of policy mechanisms and levers exist. And we can get those, John, as you said, from other communities that might have had similar goals. And right. And to some extent, this is a take things apart and put them back together kind of situation, right? It's like some of these goals might be, right, we're trying to address not escalating the cost of year-round rentals. Okay, well, what are the data we have for that? What are the tools we have for that? Now let's put that together with the tools we have and the data we have for, for conversions, right? And maybe these things are a little bit different, right? So yes, that is, I think, our plan on how we will proceed. And hopefully that.
Yeah. And to Peter's point in the chat, it would be so simple if I could say, yes, we'll just take this this ordinance from this other place, cross out South Padre Island and write in Nantucket, and we're good to go. Obviously, that's not going to be the case. What I think, this is a tip for all of you as someone who's read probably a few hundred short-term rental ordinances at this point, is when you look at other places and you see their ordinances, if you can pull them up, ask yourself sort of a couple questions. One is, what are in their context are they responding to? 2, what is the goal of this? Because you will find places that in many ways resemble Nantucket, and they just went in a totally different direction because their goal is something that maybe you would find objectionable or you think is not appropriate. You can also, I think, start to understand what would it take to enforce some of these rules. Some places get really specific. I always bring up South Lake Tahoe, California, says you can be in a hot tub after 10 p.m., but you can't have the jets on after 10 p.m. Well, great, but they're not, people aren't rappelling out of helicopters to give people violations for noise complaints at 10:05, right? So, you can look at some of those types of things. To give you an extreme example, Galveston, Texas, which has, I think, 8,000 or 9,000 short-term rental listings. They have a $50 lifetime permit. That's probably not where you're going, I would guess. That's not where anyone should go. But they're like, well, we just, they pay their taxes and we're good to go. And it's like, okay, so they have taken a very different tact in terms of what they want to do. So when you look at other places, and I do recommend looking even pretty close, Newport, Rhode Island has a fairly new ordinance. Atlantic City, which is again there are different places, but they're useful analogs sometimes. Look at what you think their goal is. Read, don't just read the whereases where they say our goal is to do this, because sometimes you read the ordinance and you go, oh, that was just the whereas clauses at the top. They actually went in a totally different direction. So that's a useful tool to start to see what other places have done, or at least stated that they wanted to do. And we can talk about how effective some of that was when we get into those more specific questions.
Right. So do we have enough, I think, for now, for Jeffrey and his team to go back, put together a presentation on, given what the policy goals we've heard so far, right? And we'll have a confirmation of that as our first topic of conversation. But Jeffrey can take those draft policy goals and all of the questions and discussions that have come out of today and try to put together a presentation, as well as, Jeffrey, I think it would be good if you could also suggest a set of definitions.
Mhm.
And suggest some background reading that I can send out to the group in advance. A couple of reports. I can include the report Peter just sent from the data platform, and some of these other sort of just background things that people might find helpful.
Mhm.
Maybe Julia, that presentation from last November could be helpful to share. So why don't if you send that to me, I can put together a sort of compilation of readings. We'll try and get that out to everyone. And then Jeffrey will count on you, and you and I can talk between now and then to go through it. And aim for, I think we've got basically an hour, maybe an hour and a half of the agenda we can spend really focused on this.
Sure.
Sound
Absolutely.
good? All right. Karen, I know you've joined late, but we are giving people a chance to just name any other sort of questions, data questions, or like important things that Jeffrey should be considering as he's trying to put together his baseline initial data sharing for the group. Is there anything you want to put forward?
Thanks for the opportunity, but I'll go back and listen to it to find out what's happening. So thanks.
Okay, yeah, and you can always send me, if you want to go back and listen, you can send me a message with
Great.
any additional questions. And Jeffrey, you and I will touch base and try and set up a time to talk a little bit later.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, well, with that, then I think we're gonna close for today. Meg, we will send, Semanish and I will send you this recording that you can get it up right away. And we'll go from there.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks,
See you
everybody.
Tuesday, next Tuesday.
Okay, thanks.